Our next speaker. While we were putting the lineup together, we were looking for ideas, thinking about ideas, and we looked at what we had in place at one point and recognized we don't really have anybody speaking about talent ID. So we asked around a little bit, and Don Smythe stepped up and proposed our next speaker. And we checked out his bio. I talked to him a little bit on the phone, and this is going to be a slam dunk for sure. Notice how I worked in that little basketball analogy. You're welcome. So Michael Meeks is manager youth player development men for Canada Basketball. Mike coached and played professional basketball in many countries in Europe and has coached with the cadet men's under 16 team that competed in the FIBA tournament in 2015. Mike was an Olympian in the 2000 Summer Olympics and competed in 2 world championships in 98 and 02. Mike has a broad view of athlete talent in his sport, and he's speaking today on the importance of talent identification. Michael, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite, Wayne, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining. I think with our country, in terms of where the sport is right now, we're kind of like a hotbed for talent. And I'm going to share my screen with you just so that we could get into it, because I know our time is limited. I put together a couple of slides here. Let me just figure out how to do that. Okay, so that should work. All right.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so last year's NBA draft, we made history with 6 athletes being drafted out of Canada. At the start of training camp, we had 11 athletes, new athletes, rookies on rosters in the NBA. If you look at the 2 New York drafts, RJ Barrett and Ignas Brazdeikis, both those athletes are graduates from our junior academy. And if there's one thing I think that is important from our perspective in terms of identification and development, and that attributes to our recent success in age group, and we are currently the #2 team in the world for men's youth basketball, is 2 things. One, we started our junior academy, and we started to identify athletes with the potential to make our teams early. Starting our first program for high performance starts around the age of 13. The next thing we did is we moved to a more athlete-centered program where we really started to dig into, the different influences that surround athletes starting around these ages, and making sure that we're aligning ourselves with their hopes and dreams and wishes and development, and everybody's on the same page, so the athlete doesn't get pulled in too many different directions. In order to identify athletes, let's go to this slide here. You can see the current number of Canadians in the NBA, and there's actually 2 more that signed later on in the year. And I think the total number at the currently in the NBA is 22 athletes. And we project that by 2024, it could be upwards of 30 athletes that are Canadian in the NBA. So one of the things that we had to do in order to be able to identify athletes is we did a lot of research. We did a lot of research to kind of figure out how was it that we wanted to play, how was it that the other countries in the world were playing, and what were the athletes that were in these making up these teams. What did they look like? We had to figure out how fast our teams had to play. We had to figure out, what the spacing was like, what our offense and defenses were like, what were the key analytical statistics that we were going to use to kind of pinpoint, are we playing well? Are we catching up? Are we playing poorly? right? And then we also had to understand the culture that we wanted to instill. Our approach with Canada basketball is definitely a top-down, bottom-up. So we're trying to identify gaps at the highest level, and then start down underneath at the grassroots level to fill those gaps and build athletes that are going to be able to take care of those at the highest level. Another part of our research was looking at what each player in each position needed to look like. What was their size? What were their technical and tactical abilities? Coming together with our different various portions of our program, our analytics, our IST, we started to put these things down on paper and come up with a profile that we wanted to achieve at the top end for each position. The point guards had to look a certain way and do certain things. The shooting guards, small forwards, power forwards, centers, etc. Once you kind of have these parameters, these profiles, you now have to be able to go down to the youngest level and identify them and find them. Who are the athletes with the most potential to achieve that standard? We start early, we start wide. Our first program for high performance, as I said before, starts at about 13 years old. So you could be 12 or 13. It's usually the 7th grade for us here in Canada. And we definitely have our eye on potential versus performance. And I think that's the one area that people seem to constantly, come up with or make errors. And they get really enamored with how well an athlete is performing at 13 years old, and they might disregard or overlook an athlete with the potential. And if you're doing selections at this age, it's not black and white. It's very gray. And I think a lot of the times it does come down to the eye of the expert. And what we notice is throughout the rest of the world, and I'm talking Europe, Australia, the people with their eye on the talent at the youngest ages is sometimes the most experienced coach, right? Because they can understand the widest gamut of what it takes to become an athlete and also develop an athlete. If I'm looking at a young center at 19 years old and that center cannot dribble, pass, doesn't run properly, I can look at that athlete and I can say, well, I think it would take me about 3 to 4 years to make that athlete a viable, productive athlete for our program. Whereas somebody without my experience would look at that athlete and say, he can't run, he can't dribble, he can't shoot, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the times we are choosing potential versus performance. In our junior academy program, we run identification camps in Ontario and in several other provinces. And we'll see hundreds of kids that come in at that age. And we're only able to take 40. And we're looking for, at the age of 13, the potential athletes that could become point guards, shooting guards, small forwards, power forwards, centers for the two age groups. And the rest of those athletes at that age, which was something that didn't really sit right with me, because you can't really cut athletes at that age. Your selections shouldn't be finite at that age. You need to have a bucket where these athletes could actually go on and continue to train and develop so that they get an opportunity down the road to when things start to come together for them, they could re-enter a high performance stream. Our LTAD, it's world class. I think the information that's in there and the parameters that it encompasses really allows for an environment to just keep track of and have a good support to develop and build athletes, ones that can attain elite status, and the other ones that, you know, might not attain it today, but can attain it down the road. Coming out of our junior academies, we begin to target athletes. And the reason why we wait until then is around 15, 16 years old, you're starting to now specialize, at least in our environments. And honestly, for basketball, a lot of them start specializing a little bit earlier. So we augment some of our training and the things that we do with them at that age. But our targeted athlete strategy, we're taking the kids that we see with the most potential, that are taking the best practices, and they're starting to excel and up our pathway, and we begin to individualize their training. And I think that's one of the things that really set us apart, is that when we find athletes, it's not a cookie cutter kind of development that kind of goes across for every athlete at those ages. We definitely try to wrap our heads around what's happening with the individual athlete mentally, socially, and emotionally, to figure out what's the best practices in order to, you know, help motivate them to train. How motivated are they to train, and what are the factors that might stand in the way of that? How do they deal with the pressures of what it is that they're going through? Physically, what are their gaps, and how do we need to address it at the specific stage of their development? You know, technically, what are the things what's the best way, or what are the gaps in their technical skills, and what do we need to address at this certain time? And then tactically, how are we going to use the athlete when we have the opportunity for them to actually compete? With our programming and our junior academy, athletes will train 3 to 4 years of just training. There is no real competition for us until U16. So they'll train for 3 years before having the opportunity to actually compete. It's just training and development with that program. Just making sure I have enough time here. So this is just a little bit of a part of the profile that we come up with for our athletes. In this situation here, it's the guard. And we do research on athletes that are the gold medal, the athletes of the countries that are winning medals. What do their point guards look like? And we will adjust this and update it after every Olympic cycle. So this is the current cycle on its way out. And for the point guard, for example, they're 6'3", the average age is about 27. And we looked at Tony Parker, Kyrie Irving, and Milos Teodosic. The other thing we kind of do is when we're looking at the gaps at the highest level, so our senior team, it's kind of where are we lacking depth in our depth chart? Are we missing depth at the point guard position? Are we missing depth at the small forward? When we looked 4 years ago, we knew we had a lack of depth at the center position. And there were a lot of reasons for this. The environment at the time was promoting universal athletes to play the game, but in doing so, we kind of forgot that tall players at the younger ages aren't able to do some of the things that smaller players are able to do in the perimeter. So it's actually not beneficial for their development if you don't have them play close to the basket. So we were asking them to do things that at their stage and age was physically very difficult for them. So we started our Tall Player Project. About 6 years ago, when I started with Canada Basketball, at the center position, you could say our centers in a U19 World Championship were about 5 years behind the rest of the world, where our point guards and shooting guards were the best in the world at their positions. So we went back down in the environment and we started to implement things. We started to pull these tall players out of the environment, get them into the gym training, figuring out which coaches were close to these athletes, and help them understand what it is that they're they had to do with these athletes. And amongst this group, if you look at number 13 here in the bottom left, Charles Betiaco, he is now the number 3 player in the world for his position and the number 1 prospect in the country for his age. And he's a center, he stands about 6'11". Number 5 right next to him, Caleb Houston, he's 6'9", one of the most versatile players we've seen in recent years in our age group. And he's currently the 5th, anywhere from 3 to 5, depending on what poll you look at, and for his position in the world, and one of the best shooters for his age. The young fellow here in the middle is actually 14 years old and stands 7'2" at last measurement. He could be up to 7'3" right now, and is regarded as one of the top prospects for his age in the world. And we could go on down the list to number 14, Enoch Gowashi, the starting center from our U16 team. But this came about by understanding the gap at the highest level and then wanting to kind of go down at the grassroots with all these players. We started to impact their development, for the most part, 12 years old. In the case of Olivier Rioux, the young fellow in the middle, we identified him as early as 9 years old. So, you know, a lot of moving parts to help keep these guys on the tracks. And that's kind of what our program does. We literally try to align ourselves with these athletes, making sure that we used our practitioners, our best practices to keep them on the tracks. Where there is a support system, we're there to set the standards for what they do in training and developing. And I think that leaves about 3 minutes by my watch in terms of what we could do for Q&A. So
absolutely, Mike, we got you. The Q&A box is on fire, but I noticed that after some of the questions went into the QA box, you actually answered some of them. So that's good news. You're ahead of yourself. I'm going to drop this one in your lap. This is from Francois. How do you measure emotional intelligence and its influence on performance on the court?
I think with us, we tend to kind of look at resilience a lot in terms of athletes and how they deal with adversity. So there isn't really a tool and there isn't one perspective that you could take in terms of being able to measure it, especially at young ages. They're developing, right? They're developing. They're not so totally set in stone. So you're kind of, and it's usually one of the biggest factors in terms of an athlete progressing down the line. You have to be able to understand, are they having fun at these young ages? The more fun you have at a younger age, the more you enjoy. When you walk in the gym, are you smiling? Are you happy? Are you running to the ball cage to grab a ball? And when you're dribbling, are you smiling, or are you walking into the gym with a frown and your head down and the ball is the last thing you want to see? I mean, that's probably how I looked when I was 39 years old, ready to retire from the sport. We don't want to see that in our young athletes.
Yeah. Great answer, Mike. Thanks. And